Thank you very much indeed. I kept asking myself this morning, what on earth am I doing here? And I imagine a number of other people have asked the same sort of question. Well, anyway, here I am, and I've got a speech, and I'm going to deliver it. We're all on the way up and down in life. I was reminded that the other day on the Underground when I saw a man and his wife reading a newspaper together, but looking round the corner. So I knew that they weren't looking at the newspaper, looking at me. And finally, the man came up to me and he said, "I'm really sorry to have to ask you this, sir, but my wife insists that I ask, who were you when you were important?" Well, there's a parable there for everybody in that little exchange. It's better than the woman who came up and said, "Are you Bruce Kent?" I said, "Yes." A long pause. "I thought you were dead." So I thought, well, I'm not dead, but I am a member of a subservient church. And so Gummer and I will disagree slightly on this. We've got a church in the field that I'm talking about today, which has been just as subservient as the Church of England. We come out of a different tradition of persecution, of desirous to be respectable English people, citizens, etc., and to prove ourselves to be as loyal to the monarch as anybody else. And so, in a sense, we've overstretched ourselves in that direction. I could be rude about universities because universities and collusion are pretty normal. I'm talking particularly about militarism. Well, the collusion between universities and the militarists of this world is very close indeed. But I'm talking about churches. And I'm going to start with the letter of Charlemagne to Pope Leo III. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Leo III. Do I need to remind you what he said? No. Well, I will anyway. "It is our part, with the help of divine holiness, to defend by armed strength the holy church of Christ everywhere, from the outward onslaughts of the pagans. It is your part, most holy Father, to help our armies with your hands lifted up to Moses, so that Christian people may everywhere and always have the victory over the enemies of his holy name." Holding up arms as a form of prayer has gone out of fashion, but obedience to these instructions from the emperor carries on down the centuries, whoever the enemy happens to be. Despite volumes of just war moral theology, I do not know of any time, any place, when a major national church has collectively opposed the military projects of its secular rulers. Not quite true. The American bishops did, at the end, oppose the Vietnam War. We look back, church people, we always honour the exceptions in the past. We look back to the Roberts, the Bonhoeffers, the Bishop Bells, the Dennis Hurleys. These are all wonderful people who spoke out against the norm of their churches at the time. They did not speak for their churches. Some were even frowned upon and marginalised. Look what happened to Pope Benedict XV, another pope to be familiar with, who so strongly opposed World War I. He was effectively dismissed as irrelevant by the hierarchies of the warring countries. The French called him a German pope, and the German called him a French pope. By all those historians who are now chewing over the awful events of 1914 to 1918, you can read all about it in history today, Benedict XV has simply been airbrushed out of history. He doesn't count within the church or within the state. In Nazi Germany, church leaders could not bring themselves to oppose the war, even at its very end. The bishop to the German forces, Franz Josef Rakowski, used extreme language and did so calling his chaplains in their charges to fight to the death for Volk and land. But he was not repudiated by his fellow bishops right up to the end. Even after the war was over, attempts were made by the Austrian diocesan authorities to suppress the story of Franz Jägerstätter, that incredibly brave young farmer, married with 3 little girls, who refused military service, refused the unconditional oath to Hitler, and was executed in consequence. His story was suppressed for 2 years until Gordon Zahn brought it out. Were those bishops in Nazi Germany or Austria, were they different from other church leaders in other places at other times? I don't think so. Military chaplains, of course, are at the sharp end of this issue. They have the strongest personal reasons for supporting state policy. Archbishop Hurley's condemnation of South African apartheid wars was not approved of by the military chaplains of his day. The head of the South African Chaplains Corps sent out this Christmas message in 1979. "The Defence Forces serve the Christ of Christmas and takes up arms to defend this Christmas patron. In this time, no conscientious objector and no pacifist can kneel before the crib of Bethlehem with a clear conscience. Went out to the South African troops running an apartheid regime. George Zabelka, who had been a chaplain to the US Air Force in the Pacific on Tinian Island at the time of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, about which then he said nothing. He changed his mind much later on. He said nothing. He commented later on, "I was brainwashed, not by force or torture, but by my church's silence and wholehearted cooperation in thousands of little ways with the country's war machine." Let's forget foreign clergy for a moment and move closer home. It's in 1967 that almost accidentally, very brashly, I somehow started a long Times correspondence about the morality of nuclear weaponry. I quoted the Second Vatican Council declaration that any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities or of extensive areas along with their population is a crime against God and man. Rapidly, the Bishop to the Forces replied, "May I assure Monsignor Kent that certainly as far as the British forces are concerned, there will be no indiscriminate use of nuclear weapons." Bishop Tickle, that was his name. We used to have to pray in Mass for Tickle our Bishop. It got very difficult to do that very often. To do that with a straight face. But anyway, Bishop Tickle was his name. He was a very decent man. And I'm sure he was simply repeating what he was told by the Ministry of Defence. But absolute nonsense, nevertheless. The Polaris warhead and the missile were far too inaccurate at that time to be targeted precisely anywhere. I think a 10-mile circuit of error was what they allowed for targeting. And anyway, the fallout from any nuclear explosion would indiscriminately go where the wind took it. And yet Tickle could say British weapons would be used discriminately, as if we were part of a great empire that excluded the United States of America. After that, I had frequent correspondence with chaplains, many of whom said in private, that they agreed with me, but please would I not make their own views known. I never have, though I've still got a file with a sellotape over it marked Chaplains Not for Publication. Why should a Christian priest be scared of making his views known? Loss of job? Pension rights? Salary? Unpopularity? Who knows? But it's a very clear form of collusion. One explanation is that the role of the church is seen by many people, keep politics out of religion and all that, is seen as simply pastoral, not political. I remember one young chaplain being told when he was appointed to Faz Lane, the nuclear submarine base, "Remember, you are here for the men, not the machines. This privatization of religion is convenient for both church and state." The most blatant example of the political use of UK chaplains came during the 80s and the cruise missile crisis and all that. One chaplain handed me a 60-page dossier prepared by the Ministry of Defence, answering every conceivable position that CN had adopted. It was supposedly the official set of replies. It was marked, "Agreed syllabus for Padres Hour." Padres Hour. They were being fed what to tell the troops during Padres Hour. I have no idea how much actual use it got, but it was clearly meant to be used to promote the government's views on nuclear matters. It's not fair to make too much of the chaplain-national relationship. They are the sharp-end chaplains of the state-church collusion, which goes on all the time. Why do you suppose that the opening ceremony next year to commemorate the start of the 1914 war is to be held in Glasgow Cathedral, with moderators, bishops and archbishops? Why not in Westminster Abbey or in Canterbury or something? Why in Glasgow? The significance of the location is very clear. Just 6 weeks or so before the independence referendum, the subliminal message will be, don't forget what wonders we united British achieved during that war. That'll be the message. They're not stupid, they know how to do it. The silence of the mainstream churches during the Cold War when people like me were accused by all sorts of respectable people of receiving money from the Soviet Union. It hurt a lot at that time. But it wasn't the insult. What hurt was the silence of the mainstream churches in defending those who took views that weren't views of the British government. More importantly, I do not remember any time a challenge coming from the churches in those days to the basic underlying Cold War media assumptions. Those assumptions were simply that the Soviets actually did have in mind a military attack on Western Europe, and the only way of dealing with that threat was to spend even more money than them and to have numerical superiority in as many weapon systems as possible, nuclear and non-nuclear. This led to the absurdly dangerous world stockpile of perhaps 50 to 60,000 nuclear warheads. But in a world of nuclear weapons, numerical superiority means very little indeed. There was, of course, a war going on, a very vigorous war, but it was an economic war, which, owing to Soviet stupidity in trying to match like for like, brought on their national bankruptcy. The West could afford it, they could not. I well remember, long after the Cold War was over, going to Russia, I think, an distinguished British historian of war and peace, and he told this to the audience. We judged then, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union by their capabilities, not their intentions, but we expected them to judge us by our intentions, not our capabilities. Where were the churches during this propaganda war? Did they offer any other peacemaking initiative way forward? Well, one at least did. Pope John XXIII did so in his 1963 encyclical letter, Pacem in Terris, addressed amazingly, for the first time in history, to all men of goodwill. He wasn't up to wound at that stage, all men of goodwill. It turned out, thankfully, that Gorbachev included himself in that number. But from the hierarchies of NATO countries came either silence or more acceptance of national attitudes, and that continues to this day. Not reported in our press, which is not neutral. Only recently, four countries alone, voted against setting up, at the suggestion of the UN General Assembly, a negotiating forum open to all countries and aimed at nuclear weapon abolition. Only four countries: United States, France, Britain, and Russia. From the hierarchies of those countries, all supposedly committed to the elimination of all such weapons of mass destruction, nothing. Why this collusion? In a church like mine, there is still an anxiety, long after the centuries of persecution and marginalization, to be seen as respectable and listened to at top level. Indeed, some senior clergy very much like being at top level. Being respectable and conformist ensures certain privileges for the churches, not personally particularly, grants for schools, charitable tax concessions, recognition of armed forces, prison and hospital chaplains, all funded, and pensions. It's rather nice. I've already given some examples for the way in which church opinion is manipulated. Dissenting voices within churches on political matters are marginalized. When I began, almost accidentally, work on the nuclear weapon moral issue, a senior canon said, not in my hearing but to somebody else, in a memorable speech, "That young Kent, he's just not thinking about his career." Well, he was quite right, absolutely right. I never had a career. Contentious statements are avoided. It's much easier to make charitable appeals than to challenge political and economic structures. You'll remember Kamara, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a Christian. When I ask why they are hungry, they call me a communist." Balancing on the high wire between Caesar and Christ was always going to be a difficult act, and it's no less difficult today. We are peoples of two kingdoms, but at least in matters of peace and war, but not on other issues of personal morality, it seems to me that owing to collusion or cooperation, Caesar gets far too much attention. Thank you.